kiddos. So today we are going to talk about colonial society of the 18th century. So that means during the 1700s, where we left off with the last lecture. We talked a little bit about how they were developed and the difference between the different colonies and the people that settled there and their motives for doing so, whether it be for economic reasons, like in Jamestown and Virginia, or in the growing cash crops in the southern colonies, or if it were the separatists or the Puritans who established their colonies at Plymouth Bay and Massachusetts. Today we're going to talk a little bit more about how the colonies became more populated and what type of groups of people were coming here. So really a lot about immigration and how kind of a unique American culture started to develop and the impact that that's going to have on the next time period that we're going to study, which is the American Revolution. So as of 1701, when you're looking at the English colonies along the Atlantic coast, they're ranging right about 250,000 people. By 1775 at 2.5 million. Looking at African Americans, right? So the only group to be brought here involuntarily went from about 28,000 African Americans enslaved people that eventually some did gain their freedom to about 500,000. Now, there are two reasons why there was such a large population boom. One is about 1 million people immigrated here. They were hearing positive things, so consider that as a pull factor. And then obviously there are push factors pushing them out of Europe, like, for example, the lack of upward mobility, economic mobility, and social mobility, civil wars, religious persecution. But really, like the economies of the Americas, of the colonies, are doing really well. And then you also have a really high birth rate among colonial families. And typically, if we're going to infer a little bit there, that's really because they have a steady food supply, they are healthier, they are making decent money. And again, all of those things are going to encourage, when you're not as stressed about putting food on the table and providing for your family, you're more likely to have more children, okay? In addition to the amount of land available to them and kind of striving for what we would kind of think about as the American dream today. So when looking at European immigrants, they're coming from England, a lot of Scottish, Welsh, Ireland, France, Sweden, Dutch, and Germany. Fewer English are coming in the 18th century than in the previous century, mostly because of the English Civil War is over. There's more jobs because of manufacturing taking off in England. It just wasn't quite as bad as it was in the 1600s. Lots of Germans. I have German heritage from this time period. They are coming over and settling Western Pennsylvania, and they're becoming farmers. They do maintain certain parts of their culture. They didn't really show that much interest in politics. They were just kind of coming here to better their lives. They did kind of assimilate to a certain extent, but by the time of the Revolution, about 6% of the total population were that of German ancestry. The Scotch Irish have a rich history here in the Appalachian Mountain region, so of North Carolina. When you think of like bluegrass music, and you think about, have you ever heard of like the Highland Games that happen like in Boone, Blowing Rock area? A lot of that is because of that rich Scotch Irish of moving into kind of the hills of, whether it be from parts of Pennsylvania, Virginia, the Carolinas, all the way down through Georgia. So as you can see, there are about 7% of the population by 1775. Then you have a group of Huguenots, so French Protestants. So the vast majority of people in France at this time are Catholic. So these are a minority. They were persecuted for having different beliefs and being in the minority. And so they came here in addition to more of the Dutch and the Swedes. Again, they're going to kind of push into the Midwest eventually. And again, I just kind of talked about why they're coming, and make sure that you understand that a push factor is something negative that is going on in your home country that would want you to look to move somewhere else. The pull factor here in America is that you have opportunities to make a good living either as a farmer or a merchant or some type of skilled artisan. Okay, they are mostly going to the middle colonies, so New York, Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, or some of the southern colonies. And primarily they're going to the middle colonies because you have such a diverse economy. You can either be a farmer or you can live in one of those urban cities in the port, like New York or Philadelphia, and find work there as an artisan. Southern colonies as well, to a certain extent, more in the frontier. A lot of that land is already owned by wealthy planters along the eastern seaboard, like along the coast and along those rivers, because of like things like the headright system, where they kind of already established those plantations. So they're looking for cheaper land out in like pretty much kind of like where we are today. The Moravians, for example, are a group of people. They're German. They went to Pennsylvania first, and then they made their way down the Great Wagon Road into the Piedmont area of North Carolina. So that would kind of be an example of Europeans moving south. Not as many as that are moving into the middle colonies because of the institution of slavery. There have to be jobs kind of available if you don't have enough money to purchase land quite yet. You wouldn't want to compete, or it was difficult to compete on a plantation picking tobacco when that plantation owner can just buy enslaved Africans. So they are the single largest non-English speaking immigrant group, and obviously it was involuntary. Outside of the South, Black Americans worked in different types of occupations. They're typically some sort of labor, whether it be a day laborer, they're masons and blacksmiths, some slaves, but for the most part, some earned wages, and you could own property this early in our history. Every colony by this point in time, though, had passed some sort of discriminatory law that limited their rights and certain opportunities. So those range from like not being able to sit on a jury, maybe not being able to own a weapon, maybe not being able to like own your own business or something of that nature, which is interesting because you'll see those same types of laws coming back, but like even more extreme after the Civil War, once all enslaved African Americans have been emancipated after the Civil War. By 1775, 20% of the colonial population were African American. So that's free and enslaved. 90% of them are living in the southern colonies. In parts of South Carolina and Georgia, the deep South, where rice and indigo are very profitable cash crops that are very labor intensive and require a great number of manual labor and hands basically to harvest these crops. They are outnumbering whites. And that's going to kind of be consistent like as we move into the 19th century, into the 1800s, once the cotton gin is invented. Cotton is going to become a major cash crop, and it's very similar. It's labor intensive, and it just needs a lot of, as long as you have the land to plant it on, you need hands to be able to pick it. Again, remember we talked a little bit about North Carolina, how North Carolina had a really low percentage of whites owning slaves and a really low number of large-scale plantations, and it's because of the geography. It kind of limited the ports to be able to get your crops out to market in a timely manner. And so that's why you'll notice that North Carolina did not have a large enslaved population. And that will affect society as well. Within the societal structure, most of the population is English in some sort of origin. Most Americans speak English. Even if you're an immigrant, you're learning to speak English and in those traditions. African and non-English immigrants brought some diversity, and so things were modified, especially like if you think about African music being kind of incorporated into white culture. The same with the Scotch-Irish, like with bluegrass music, foods especially. Each colony did, though, have a representative assembly. So when we're looking at consistencies, they believed in representation. Now, again, it's white landowning males, and typically the further south you go, so Virginia further down, and it was consistent in North Carolina as well, you had to own more land in order to be able to be elected to that legislature. Where the further north, it was a little bit more representative. Governors in all the colonies are appointed by the king. However, some colonies did figure out how to kind of manipulate that to where the legislature gets to decide their salary, for example. So like if you didn't like what your governor was doing, you could like lower their salary, or if you did like them and you appreciate it, you would kind of raise it to show them appreciation. Most colonies allow freedom of religion. Massachusetts excluded non-Christians and Catholics. But they're mostly really conservative because of that Puritan history. Rhode Island and Pennsylvania were the most liberal, where they were like have the most diverse. And you're going to see the Pennsylvania population be quite large because of that more welcoming, those liberal political policies on religion and diversity as a whole. Within the home, it's somewhat traditional is what you would kind of think with like from like biblical, like the man is the provider, then the wife kind of takes care of the children. There are no social extremes really like in Europe where it's like nobles and peasants. There are class systems, no doubt about it. But it's much more narrow. So like there were gentlemen and then there were kind of like, lower class people. But just because you were lower class didn't mean that your son could not make something of himself, or even you, like by a certain point in your life. Wealthy landowners are at the top, and then you kind of have artisans, merchants, and small farmers. They're going to make up the majority of the common people. And I say common people, the common man, because we're going to learn more about that in the future when it comes to more democratic practices. So apart from African Americans, all colonists really had an opportunity to move up. So if you are a farmer, but if you made enough money, or a merchant, for example, you could save enough money to maybe send your son to college, like University of North Carolina or the University of Virginia, to get an education to where maybe he could be a banker or a lawyer or something like that, or preacher. That was one of the more common things that people wanted their sons to become. The family is the economic and social center of colonial life. They are in charge of expanding the economy. There's a large food supply because of this family life together, especially like in Pennsylvania. If let's say that you grow corn or wheat on your farm, you would have a bunch of children in order to be able to have your children like help you on the farm. Like they are an asset in labor. There's the reason that there are not a lot of enslaved people on Pennsylvania or New York farms. There were some, but for the most part, there weren't a lot. It's because you didn't need a ton of hands. Like you and your 8 kids and your wife could handle that together. People start to marry younger and younger. They're having more children than they did in Europe. And again, it helps on the farm, but also like you felt confident that you could provide for them. That kind of shows that confidence in the colonial economy. At this point in time in history, 90% of colonists lived on a farm. And we're not talking about like a plantation. It's whether or not it was a large plantation growing cash crops in Virginia, or maybe like even in Massachusetts. We're going to talk a little bit about the geography. Like Massachusetts is not known for farming, but you could farm in Massachusetts. It would be small. You could make money off of it, orchards and potatoes and cabbage and things like that. Nowhere near the type of like money that you would be making in the deep South, but it's something that could supplement maybe your small business, like if you had like a general store or something like that in town, or your boarding house, or your, I think I already said general store, but you kind of get the idea. So political and economic power is reserved for men. This was something that carried over from English law. He did have the right to beat his wife. That's always an interesting one that people like. Women, colonial women, on average, had 8 children. Now, not all of those children lived into adulthood, even though the infant mortality rate is going to go down during this time period. Typically, like once you get to age 12, the likelihood of you surviving into adulthood is much higher. Women are responsible for the housework, cooking, cleaning, making clothes. We'll get to that, how there's a big turning point with the market revolution in the next unit. But they made their clothes. You've seen like the spinning wheel where they, do their yarn and all of that. Medical care, they're in charge of educating their children. So kind of like their sons for the most part to a certain extent. They would educate their sons in order to either like help their father to a certain age where they can read and write basic arithmetic, to where maybe they could help their father, the business side of the farm or in town. And then they would educate their daughters enough to become a suitable wife to then be able to like educate their own children. So that would be kind of a selling point for your daughter, because you're trying to marry off your daughter. That's your whole purpose. Like if you have a daughter, it's like, well, I got to get her married. And so you want her to be as appealing, like intellectually, to a suitor, so that what he'll see in her is like, oh, well, she'll be a good mother to my son, and my son will be prepared, and maybe he will go off to Yale or to Columbia or Harvard or something like that. But in addition to all the stuff that they do at home, they also work side by side with their families on the farms, typically, or in the business in town. In the 1760s, when you're looking at British trade, it's done with the colonies. Where we talked a little bit about mercantilism in the last unit. It's very important to understand that the whole point of the colonies is to benefit the economy of the mother country. The more money you have, the more natural resources equals more money and more power kind of on the world stage. And so are they Britain yet? England is still competing with Spain and Portugal, for example, and kind of like world domination, if you will. And the colonies are helping them do that. The British government did allow the colonies to have some type of manufacturing. So flour, obviously, because that's kind of easy to do. They need and the reason that they let them do certain ones is that it wouldn't be in competition with the factories in England. Rum was the other one. It just kind of made sense. It played a large role in the triangular trade. They did not allow textiles to be made in factories in the colonies. And that's important to understand now, because it'll make sense a little bit later with the market revolution. But because England's factories were producing so many textiles, they kind of had a monopoly on it, and they wanted to keep it that way, which also means that England gets to decide the prices of the textiles, of the fabric that they're sending over to the colonies for the colonists to buy for their homes. Most of the economies did start predominantly in agriculture as communities started to prosper, right? So like as the general store is making more money, and the blacksmith and the boarding house and all of these different little businesses, if you will, they need certain services in those towns. So doctors, lawyers, ministers, teachers. And so with that becomes a new level of, I guess, we would kind of call it like a middle class today. They didn't really have a middle class back then, but providing like a service industry for the colonial era was moving up in society. So more about each region's economy. And this is important to understand the difference between these four, excuse me. So in the New England colonies, these are the northern colonies. So Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island. They are geographically, so it's rocky soil, very long, harsh winters. Farming is limited here, okay? Provided just enough for your family. Again, you might be able to sell something supplemental, but it was not a profitable venture. People tried. Even though like early in like the early 1600s, they did okay with it, that soil does get depleted and you have smaller harvest each year. And so it just wasn't a dependable trade. And so the economy starts to shift more towards being merchants and trade and artisans and shipbuilding and rum making. That is their economy. And it's so important to understand that, because when we get to the Revolutionary era, there's a reason why the revolution began in New England, and it has to do with the finances, and it has to do with their commercial, trade-based economy. Logging, shipbuilding, fish trade, rum, distilling, those are all kind of what, and then just the buying and selling of goods. They have great port cities available to them, especially Boston. And that is how they are going to make their money and their living and maintain the way of life that they enjoy at this point in time. Moving to the middle colonies, rich soil, and this is going to be the breadbasket region. So up with New York and New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, they have good soil. They're going to make, when we say breadbasket, so your grains, corn, wheat, barley. You can use those things obviously for food, but they're also, you can use to make whiskey and alcohol, like grain alcohol. And that'll come into play a little bit later as well. Farms are larger, about 200 acres, 300 acres, sometimes smaller than that even. And again, these crops are not super labor intensive, so you and your family can work the land. Maybe if you're having a really good season, you might have to hire a few people, and that's something that people knew. They would move onto the farms looking for work, as like temporary workers, indentured servants, some hired hands. Some might have enslaved people, like that they work side by side with. So a family might own one slave or two slaves, and they would work together with the family because they just might need that extra hand. Small manufacturing with iron making outside of Pennsylvania. But again, it's kind of has the best of both worlds. So you have the farming component and the agricultural component, but you also have really decent sized port cities of New York and Philadelphia that kind of help bring the economic diversity in addition to the cultural diversity of the middle colonies. The Chesapeake colonies are Maryland, Virginia, and kind of North Carolina. We've talked about before how North Carolina is a little odd because of the geography. The climate is warmer, it's more humid, the soil is more rich, it has longer growing seasons, which means that you can grow crops like tobacco in addition to corn and wheat and things like that. Tobacco needs warmer weather and a longer growing season to grow. It is also more labor intensive than wheat or corn, which is why they need more labor to harvest it and to tend to it, which is one of the reasons that they turned to African slaves. Most people, though, do live on small family farms with no slave labor. Plantations were kind of in the minority in the South at this point in time. Even by the time of the Civil War, only 25% of Southerners, white Southerners, owned slaves. So it wasn't something that, and that's just one or more. When you think about the institution of slavery and you think about the South, I think a lot of people think about everyone owned slaves and they owned lots of them. And that's just not the case. It was a minority of people that owned them. Their impact was great. There's no doubt about that. But it didn't look quite like what you would imagine when you see movies or on TV. Plantations, we're talking about thousands of acres. So they grow their own food. Think of it as like a conglomeration. So they grow their own food to supplement the lives of the humans that live on that plantation in addition to the cash crops. So the Chesapeake region and North Carolina, it's tobacco, timber for sure, lumber. North Carolina does have a rich history in lumber. When you move further south, where it's even warmer for even longer, now you're looking at rice and indigo plantations. They're very profitable. That way, and there might be some tobacco there, but if everyone grows tobacco in the deep South, then the supply is going to go up and the price is going to come down. So South Carolinians and Georgians realized that they could make more money selling rice and indigo. And they were in some sugarcane too, a little bit. But again, they didn't want the sugarcane. If you grow sugarcane, well, they're growing sugarcane in the West Indies, and you don't want to flood the market. I was going to say something, and it was going to be really good, and I don't remember what it was. I apologize. Plantations are located on rivers in order to ship those exports directly to Europe. Remember, with mercantilism, it has to be on an English ship. And again, that's why North Carolina didn't have a ton of plantations. It's because really they only have the Cape Fear River, and that's not a really deep, long river. Where like in South Carolina, you have the Ashley and the Cooper. You have the Savannah River where they go inland, and they're really big rivers to where you can ship those crops as quickly as possible to market. Religion. So the majority of colonists belong to various Protestant denominations. They are by far the vast majority. Remember, we talked about with Maryland that some Catholics settled there. Judaism in little pockets of New York City and Boston. But for the vast majority, Americans at this time were Protestant. And that's because they majority came from England, and kind of that history of escaping religious persecution, since the vast majority of people in Europe were Catholic at this point. Jews and Catholics and Quakers are going to be discriminated against because they're just outsiders. They're different. Even though Quakers are considered Protestant, we talked in the last about how they were just very simple, and they were passive, and so they didn't like war, and so they were just kind of an easy target to pick on. And then Jews have a long history of being discriminated against around the world. And in addition to Catholics, it's just because they were the minority. The Anglican Church, which hopefully you remember our little Religion 101 talk, that's the Church of England. They symbolized the crown itself, right? Because the head of the church is the crown. It is the monarch. And so it symbolized that English control, which is going to play an important part, like as we get towards the revolution and when you're looking at people picking sides. Governments established churches early on. So like when they would create these little towns and cities, like typically the church would be at the center of it and tax dollars would help support it. But because over time, different religious denominations started to kind of pop up. So like the Baptist church or, even the Quakers and the Puritans and different groups, as it became more diverse, it started to get a little bit, this is where we get the separation of church and state. It said, well, what is going to be do we need an official like religion? And they didn't like the idea of that because it was so diverse. So that's when they just said, all right, well, the church gets no money. Or shouldn't say that, less money. Because even today, the churches, they don't have to pay property tax and things like that. That's something that our government has decided to kind of keep doing. And so one of the most important cultural movements of the 18th century is going to be the Great Awakening. During the Puritan times, you guys have read, and we've talked about ministers that talked a lot about sin and damnation and kind of like scaring people into church. And what you saw as an effect of that is that people were pushed away from New England, right? They tried the halfway covenant, like people were moving away from the Puritan strictness. They started to focus more on the economy as the economy was doing well. They're like, oh, well, I might open up my store on Sunday or kind of things like that. People were not as focused on religion as they had been in the past. So in the 1700s, early 1700s, ministers started to focus instead on more of a benign, like kind and loving God. And in response to that, the Great Awakening kind of happened because people stopped going to church. And so they were like, well, we need to kind of ramp this up. Like people have become complacent and they're not doing what they need to do. And you have this sin, and drinking was a really big thing. And so in order to increase church membership, they started these revivals, right? And so Jonathan Edwards, a Congregationalist, was a certain denomination of this time period, kind of like basically the Puritans are kind of gone and Congregationalists are kind of a more moderate version of them. And in one of his sermons, it's called Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God. And he argued that God was angry with human sinfulness, and that if you did not repent and you did not act in a more godly way, that you are going to burn in hell, kind of bringing back those ideas. So he and George Whitefield was like a celebrity of the time period. They traveled the country, especially throughout the South, which was never really that religious before this. And I mean, we're talking about tens of thousands of people that would come to watch them preach. And it was very kind of like speak on their level. It's not like they were, high and mighty. It was really like this was someone like us, and trying to kind of convert them. They tried to appeal to the people a little bit. They're held in barns and fields, and the common people would become saved by this experience. And that, if you've ever heard of like a revival or like a lock-in that we have around here today, different churches do it. That's kind of the idea, is that we're going to hold this event. People are going to come, they're going to share their testimony, and we're going to convert people, and we're going to change their lives in that type of way. And they did. I was listening to a podcast at one point where they said that George Whitefield was like the Justin Bieber of this time period, because people would go, like, they would travel hundreds of, and like 100 miles back then, that took you days to do in order to watch George Whitefield preach, just like how you would do to watch Justin Bieber in concert, right? So what was the impact? People are saved, and they would talk about being saved. Ministers do lose a little bit of authority, because it was more of like people reading the Bible, especially as they're becoming more literate. They're reading the Bible in their homes, and people are kind of spreading out in the South a little bit. And so they might not have availability to a preacher as much as they would in like a city. The rise of the Baptist Church and the Methodist Church during this time period, it'll grow even more so during the Second Great Awakening in the 1800s. But as denominations increase, right, we talked about before, separation of church and state, that was requested and that was put into practice. And that, again, that freedom of religion within our First Amendment, you'll see that happening during the Revolution, or well, after the Revolution. For the first time, though, whether you were Dutch or Swiss or English or Irish, you have this common experience, this common American experience. And that's called democratization as well, is people are viewing authority differently. Like, the preacher isn't above me. We are equals, and we are all, like, in the eyes of God, kind of the same. Another thing that I think is most important with the timing of the Great Awakening is it's within like a generation of the Revolution. And one of the things that people is they're starting to question the authority. So if they're questioning authority, religious authority, their thought is, if I can choose how I want to worship God, right? I don't like how the Congregationalists are doing it. I'm going to go check out this Baptist church down the street. I really like how their sermon and their services go. Like, this is how I'm going to worship God. If I get to choose how I want to worship God, shouldn't I be able to choose how I want to be governed? And that is going to prompt this generation of American colonists, or I should say British colonists, to challenge the British monarchy when they don't like how something's going, like, oh, I don't know, taxation without representation. They're going to question it with a combination of the Enlightenment, right, and enlightened thinkers. It's going to cause them to be like, well, I want something different now. And that different government is going to be an independent government. And so that's very important when thinking about the Great Awakening. Yes, it's an important social movement, but more so the impact that it had on causing the American Revolution within, 20 years or so. So in the early 1600s, most colonists did not have time to pursue like leisurely activities. Like, they worked, they came home, they went to bed, they got up the next day, they did it again. By the 1700s, looking into art and literature, they're having more of that luxury. So we now have it like a distinct American architecture with Georgian style. So if you think anything like colonial homes, you can kind of see the windows and the shutters and the roofs pitched a certain way. Along the frontier, you're going to see the log cabin type look. Within literature, especially like religious sermons, those are going to be the most famous things that people are reading because of the Great Awakening. The most popular author of the time period is going to be Benjamin Franklin. So Poor Richard's Almanac came out in 1732. He was also known for his papers that he wrote on scientific experiments and inventions, and that moves right in with the Enlightenment fairly well, and people were fascinated by him. Education, so the first tax-supported schools were established originally by the Puritans. It was to educate boys, primary schools, middle colonies, church-sponsored or private. You had like the Moravians, for example, and like the Quakers, they believed in educating women. So the Moravians of like the 1730s, they had the Single Sisters House where women were educated there. Southern plantations, you're so spread out. So where in the north, you're a little bit clustered closer together. In the south, those plantations and then those farms that have to be scattered in between, they're so isolated that really only wealthy people could afford to hire tutors to come live on their plantations and tutor their sons and daughters to a certain extent. The mothers still kind of took care of that. The most well-educated person in the community was typically the minister when we're talking about like higher education. Everyone else was kind of like an apprenticeship. So when we think about 4-year colleges today, that was a minister. So when you think about the colonial colleges, we call these the Ivy Leagues. They've been around since the 1600s. Harvard was founded in 1636. That was a Puritan theological institution. Like you went there to become a minister. The Anglicans opened up William and Mary, which is in Williamsburg. The Congregationalists opened Yale. Now, after the Great Awakening is when you have a lot of other schools being opened. So Princeton, Columbia, Brown, Rutgers, and Dartmouth, the other Ivies. But again, they're educating ministers first and foremost. And then it'll become law. That'll be one of the ones that they do. And then finance and banking. I'm not exactly sure what that degree was called back then, but now looking at the press, there were 5 newspapers in 1725 and 40 in 1776. Okay. Early on, they were issued weekly. They were month-old news that had happened for Europe and different ads and for goods and services. They're seeking runaway indentured servants or slaves. Because newspapers at this point in time, when we think about freedom of the press, and I think that this is something that's very important to me, and you can apply this today as much as you want to, newspaper reporters and printers ran a really large risk of being jailed for libel. Libel is when if you print something and it's not true. So if it like defames someone, like if you printed something about how Miss Cruz is not a great teacher, and then you could be sued, right, for libel is what it's called. And so people kind of avoided it. Like there wasn't really a lot of news going on. And there wasn't a lot of criticism of government officials. Now, John Peter Zenger is a New York editor and publisher, and he had kind of had enough with the governor of New York who had been appointed by the king. And so he had published this piece that was critical of the New York governor. He was arrested and jailed. And the lawyer argued like everything that he's saying is true. Like he's corrupt and he gets paid too much money and he doesn't care about the people. And what's interesting here is the jury ignored the English law. You are not allowed to criticize a government official, the governor. But the people ignored the law and acquitted Zenger because they knew that what he printed was true. Now, it didn't guarantee freedom of press at this point. But again, when you look at how many newspapers there are in 1776, you're going to start to see that the king is going to start trying to limit more and more people assembly and petition and the press. He's going to start to crack down on that. And that's one of the reasons when they did write the Bill of Rights that they wanted to include those things, the press included in it. So all of this that's going on right now, it's going to make sense as to why we added some of those amendments to the Constitution in the 1780s, excuse me. Okay, the Enlightenment. Some well-educated Americans were attracted to it's a European movement. This is John Locke, and it was in literature and philosophy, and it basically questioned or taught people how to question. You can improve society with the use of human reasoning and logic. John Locke was one of the most famous ones, famous enlightened philosopher. He argued that the government is supreme, but it's bound by certain natural laws. And those natural laws are based on the people, that the government works for the people don't work for the government. And that if the government is not serving the people, then the people have the right to change that. So as you can see with the ideas of the Enlightenment and then also the Great Awakening, again, this is what this choice, this questioning of authority, it's kind of this perfect storm, in addition to the economic issues brought on by the French and Indian War, where the crown starts to limit those rights of the colonists, that kind of creates, it's a cataclysm that's going to lead to the American Revolution. All right, structure of government in all the colonies was pretty similar. You had a governor, you had some sort of legislature or a colonial assembly, 2 houses, so bicameral. The lower house was elected by the voters, and then they would vote on taxes. And the upper house, they were appointed by council, and that's actually how our legislature, federal level, worked as well. Originally, the senators were not elected by the people; they were appointed by the state assembly, so the General Assembly. So it's going to become more democratic even over time. But that is something consistent in all of the colonies, is that the basic different branches of government kind of already existed before we were even an independent nation. And that was something that England let us do. They didn't really care how we governed ourselves. As long as we were making money for them through mercantile policy, they were perfectly fine with it. Local government in New England and Middle colonies had town hall meetings. That was very, very important. It was popular vote. It was super democratic. You'd show up to vote on something, and that was it. You would vote directly on it. Southern colonies were a little bit different because, again, everyone was really spread out. You would have a sheriff that would vote, that would kind of enforce laws. You would have to move into it was a big deal if they called the assembly together for voting. There's a scene in The Patriot where the main character is a South Carolina farmer, and he gets word that this assembly is going to vote, and so he's got to pack up his family and ride into Charleston for a week or so, because it's that long of a process to get there. So they met very seldom. Okay, so people banned from voting were women, poor white men, enslaved people, and most free blacks as well. That's one of those laws, those discriminatory laws that was passed. Within the 17th century, religious restrictions in Massachusetts, remember, you had to be a Puritan or someone that had experienced that conversion process in order to vote. But by now, most people are voting. You had to own at least some small percentage of land, even in those more liberal colonies like Pennsylvania and Rhode Island. So do the elected people represent the few privileged elite or the larger society of common citizens? This is kind of a question that when people vote, they kind of have to ask themselves, do I vote on what's best for me and my family, depending on where I am, or do I vote for the common good? The House of Burgesses was restricted to just certain wealthy families. Massachusetts, you did have more small farmers, more educated and elite families. They held that power. And that's the same for today, you guys. Unfortunately, we do have that upward mobility, but still, when you look at Congress and you look at the Senate, when you look at their net worth, they have money. That is something that's consistent, because that's something that's generational for the most part. And that's where the power kind of lies, because you do have to have that power in order to be able to run. You have to have, for elected office, you have to have money in order to do that. Commoners often deferred to the wealthy and the educated to make decisions for them. That's something when political parties, American political parties, are going to be born in the next unit, like after the revolution. We will talk about how these political parties are going to be formed and the views that they're going to have. Despite restricted participation, the colonial political system, it was unlike anything else in the world. And it's going to inspire the Articles of Confederation during the war. And then when that doesn't go quite as planned, it was refined, and the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution and separation of powers and federalism and all of that is going to be the basis for other modern industrialized nations. They're going to base their governments off of ours. So this is, even though, you know, this is still the colonial era, it is a really interesting time where you can start to see the seeds planted for the revolutionary period. But during that revolutionary period, that is when our founding fathers are creating a government that's still around today. And so when you talk about like the Second Amendment or the First Amendment, the colonial era is where those first seeds are being planted in kind of creating the system that we know today. So that's it for this lecture. I hope you learned something, and I will see you next time. Bye.